The shocking allegations about Princess Diana's death. Authorities now reviewing the new and sensational claim that she was actually murdered by the British.
I tried to warn her. Those were the exact, agonized words that broke decades of absolute silence as Earl Charles Spencer finally stood in the shadowed halls of Althorp House, clutching a secret diary that could dismantle the British royal family. For about 3 decades, the grieving brother had kept his head bowed and his lips sealed. But the sudden discovery of a hidden tracking device inside Diana's favorite family heirloom changed everything. As the protector of the Spencer legacy, Charles had always watched his sister's back. But Diana was a woman drowning in a sea of invisible enemies. They were siblings bound by blood and targeted by a ruthless system. Yet when Charles finally discovered the fatal trap being laid for her, he was met with a terrifying realization. The people she trusted most were the ones steering her toward her doom. Charles tried to warn her before she boarded that fateful car in Paris. But did Diana ignore his desperate pleas, or was she already too far gone to be saved? What did Charles find in her final, frantic letter that forced him to finally break his silence today? And what is the chilling truth behind the warning she received too late? The heavy oak doors of Althorp House had remained shut to the media for decades, keeping a devastating family secret locked within its cold, limestone walls. Outside, the vast Northamptonshire estate stretched out under a heavy, suffocating gray sky. But inside, the private study of Earl Charles Spencer, the atmosphere was even tighter. It was a room frozen in time. The scent of old leather, beeswax, and centuries of dust hung in the air. But today, the silence that had protected a dynasty was about to be shattered. Charles stood before his grandfather's locked mahogany desk. His hands, usually steady and poised, trembled slightly as he inserted a tarnished brass key into the drawer's brass lock. The lock turned with a heavy, metallic click that seemed to echo through the empty hallways of the great manor. From the dark velvet lining of the drawer, Charles slowly withdrew 2 objects: a tarnished silver signet ring, its crest worn smooth by years of anxious handling, and a faded, handwritten letter dated exactly 3 weeks before Princess Diana's fatal crash in Paris. For 29 years, the world had believed the official narrative: a tragic accident, a reckless driver, and an inescapable swarm of paparazzi. But the world did not know about the final, desperate confrontation between the Spencer siblings. They did not know about the warning that could have changed history. Charles looked directly toward the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. He could still hear her voice, thin and terrified, echoing in this very room. He clutched the silver ring so tightly the metal bit into his palm. "I knew what was coming," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound grief and a long-buried, simmering rage. "I saw the trap being laid out for her. I begged her. I screamed at her. I tried to warn her. But by then, they already had her completely in their grip." He remembered how it started, not with a sudden threat, but with a series of subtle, terrifying shifts in her behavior. It was the summer of 1997. The papers showed a radiant, smiling Diana vacationing on yachts. But the sister who called Charles in the middle of the night was a woman living in a state of absolute siege. She had begun speaking in code, changing her phone numbers weekly, and accusing her closest staff of being plants. Charles had initially wondered if the pressure of the divorce had finally broken her spirit. But then she made an unannounced visit to Althorp, arriving not in a royal vehicle with a police escort, but in a dusty, unmarked sedan driven by a stranger. When she stepped out, she didn't look like a princess. She looked like a fugitive running out of time. And as Charles walked out to meet her, he saw something that made his blood run cold. As the 9th Earl Spencer, Charles presided over a lineage older and wealthier than many European ruling houses, a dynasty anchored by the sprawling 13,000-acre Althorp estate and a fortune built over 5 centuries of aristocratic dominance. He was a man accustomed to the quiet exercise of absolute privilege, an intellectual who had watched his sister ascend to become the most photographed woman on earth. Diana, the Princess of Wales, possessed a global status that transcended mere royalty. Her wealth was measured not just in the historic Spencer tiaras or her staggering multi-million-pound divorce settlement, but in the unmatched currency of public adoration. Yet, beneath the glittering veneer of their shared aristocratic upbringing lay a deeply rooted vulnerability born from childhood abandonment, a time when their mother had packed her bags and left Althorp forever, leaving a young Charles and an even younger Diana to navigate the freezing corridors of the estate alone. That early trauma had forged a profound, unspoken protective instinct in Charles. Years later, during their youth, Charles had watched a falconer on the estate ground a magnificent hawk by hooding it, blinding the bird to its surroundings until it grew completely dependent on its handler. A chilling memory that now flashed vividly in his mind as he recalled how the royal establishment had slowly done the exact same thing to Diana, systematically stripping away her trusted old bodyguards and replacing them with unfamiliar faces. Standing in the dim light of the study, Charles could still see the phantom image of his sister from that final, tense visit to Althorp. She had been wearing a stunning, bespoke diamond tennis bracelet, a recent gift from an influential international associate. But as she sat across from him, she had continuously picked at the clasp until her skin bled, a subconscious tic that foreshadowed a hidden, darker complication. "Charles, they are watching the house," Diana had whispered that afternoon, her eyes darting frantically toward the towering palace windows. "Every time I pick up the phone, there is a hollow echo. It isn't just the press anymore. Someone is inside my circle." Charles had tried to soothe her, stepping closer to close the heavy velvet drapes. "Diana, you are safe here at Althorp. Nobody can breach these gates without my permission. You don't understand the reach they have," she had replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying flat monotone. "The crown isn't a family, Charles. It's an engine, and right now, I am standing directly in the gears." The memory of Diana's trembling hands haunted Charles as he paced the length of his grandfather's study. The vast wealth of the Spencer dynasty had always bought them security. Yet looking back at the summer of 1997, Charles realized that all the gold in Althorp's vaults could not buy protection from a phantom. Diana had been living in a state of hypervigilance, a direct result of her childhood years spent navigating the cold, silent rooms of Althorp after their mother's sudden departure. As children, they had learned to read the shifting moods of the adults around them like weather patterns. Now, that survival mechanism had turned into a terrifying, constant radar. Diana had begun noticing subtle anomalies in her daily routine. A folder on her desk at Kensington Palace would be shifted 2 inches to the left. Her personal address book would have a faint crease in the spine, as if it had been forcefully copied. These were not the clumsy intrusions of tabloid journalists. Charles, drawing on his own connections within high society diplomatic circles, recognized the signature of a professional intelligence operation designed to slowly drive a target mad. It was a psychological warfare tactic known as gaslighting, and it was working perfectly. "They want me to look unstable, Charles," Diana had told him during a frantic midnight phone call from a burner phone she had purchased under an assumed name. "If the public thinks I've lost my mind, then nothing I say about what goes on behind those palace walls will ever be believed." "Who is they, Diana?" Charles had asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the dark parkland outside his window. "Give me names. I will have my lawyers draft an injunction by morning." "You can't sue a shadow, Charles," she whispered, her breathing shallow and ragged. "It's the people who smile at me in the morning and sign my security clearances in the afternoon. They are the ones rewriting my life." What Diana did not know, and what Charles had only recently uncovered through a decades-long investigation was the presence of a double agent within her own household staff. A trusted butler, whose salary was quietly supplemented by an offshore account linked to a security firm with deep ties to the state, had been systematically feeding her false information. This man had planted the forged documents that suggested her closest bodyguards were selling her diaries to the press. This betrayal was a calculated strike. By convincing Diana that her royal security detail was corrupt, the conspirators forced her to do the one thing that would seal her fate. She voluntarily dismissed her elite, government-trained protection officers. Charles had tried to intervene, sending a trusted former military captain from his own estate to act as her advisor. But Diana's paranoia had already been weaponized. She turned the man away at her gate, convinced he was just another spy sent to watch her. The shield was down, and the trap was officially set. 2 weeks before Diana's departure for France, the summer heat in Northamptonshire had grown oppressive, thick with the scent of dry grass and impending storm. Charles stood near the grand perimeter wall of Althorpe, his eyes locked on a black, unmarked SUV idling on the public lane just beyond his boundary gates. It had no license plates, and its windows were heavily tinted, reflecting the golden afternoon light like two blind, obsidian eyes. The vehicle had been there for 3 days, never moving, its engine humming with a low, predatory vibration. Charles felt a cold, familiar dread settle deep in his chest. This was the physical manifestation of the invisible net Diana had described. Decades earlier, their father, the 8th Earl Spencer, had taught a young Charles how to spot a tracker while hunting in the Scottish Highlands. Always look for the shape that doesn't belong to the forest. Now, looking at the sleek, modern machine parked on his historic family land, Charles knew it did not belong. He walked back to the house, his polished leather boots clicking sharply against the gravel, and found Diana sitting in the library. She was staring blankly at the portrait of their ancestor, Georgiana Spencer, another woman who had been swallowed whole by the demands of aristocratic marriage. "They're outside, aren't they?" Diana asked without turning her head. She was nervously spinning the heavy gold watch on her wrist, the one given to her by her new, highly connected associate. "They're on the public lane," Charles replied, standing beside her. "I've instructed the estate gamekeepers to clear them off, but the local police say they have no jurisdiction. Whoever is in that vehicle has a clearance that overrides my authority." "Diana." "It's a countdown, Charles," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "They want me to run. They're making life here so unbearable, so terrifying, that I will flee to the only place they've left open for me." Charles knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then don't run. Stay here. Althorpe has withstood sieges during the Civil War. We can withstand this. If you cross that English Channel, you lose the home court advantage. You lose the law." Diana looked at him, her eyes wide with a heartbreaking mixture of gratitude and profound despair. "You still think the law protects us, Charles? That's your mistake. The law is a weapon they built. They're letting me leave because they want me in a place where no one has to ask permission to pull the trigger." As she spoke, the heavy grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, its deep, resonant toll sounding like a funeral knell. In that moment, Charles noticed a tiny, flickering red light reflecting off the polished wood of the library table, originating from the bezel of Diana's gold watch. He thought it was a mere trick of the afternoon light, but the memory would return to haunt him decades later. The psychological fortress surrounding Diana did not crumble from an external assault. It was dismantled systematically from within, piece by piece, by those she trusted most. By early August, a brilliant but predatory rogue journalist had breached her inner defenses, presenting her with highly sophisticated, fabricated bank statements. These forged documents falsely proved that her most loyal private secretary and her former head of security were receiving massive, recurring payments from the intelligence services to monitor her movements. This was the master stroke of the conspiracy, a betrayal designed to exploit the deep-seated abandonment fears Charles knew she had carried since childhood. Charles had received an urgent classified tip from an old university friend who was now working deep within the Foreign Office. The friend had warned him that a dossier of fake materials had been successfully introduced into Diana's orbit. Terrified, Charles immediately dialed Diana's private number, but the line buzzed with a rhythmic, digital interference. When he finally reached her on an unlisted line, he didn't hear his vibrant sister. He heard a woman utterly paralyzed by fear. "You have to stop talking to that reporter, Diana," Charles pleaded, his hand gripping the receiver tightly as he paced his study. "He is feeding you lies. The documents are a setup. They are using your fear of being watched to drive you away from the only people who can actually keep you safe." "I saw the bank accounts, Charles," Diana cried, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "The signatures are real. The transfer codes are real. I am completely alone in that palace. Even the guards outside my bedroom are taking money to report on what I wear to bed." "It is an intelligence fabrication, Diana," Charles countered, his voice rising in desperation. "They are isolating you. Can't you see the pattern? Once they convince you that everyone is a traitor, you will run straight into the arms of the people they have chosen for you." "I have to protect my boys," she whispered, her breathing ragged. "The reporter promised he would publish the truth about the surveillance, if I cooperated. If I don't, they will release the doctored tapes of my private calls with William and Harry. They will make me look unfit." Charles closed his eyes, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The trap was breathtaking in its cruelty. By threatening her connection to her sons, they had found her absolute breaking point. Diana was no longer acting on logic. She was acting on pure, maternal survival instinct. She was being steered toward France, toward a private security apparatus that answered to a foreign billionaire rather than the British crown, leaving her completely exposed to whatever tragedy was waiting in the dark. The devastating realization of the rogue journalist's deception lay like a physical weight in Charles's chest as the days ticked down toward mid-August. The dynamic between the siblings had shifted from one of mutual support to a desperate, frantic struggle of wills. Charles knew the history of their family was littered with tragic figures who had succumbed to the pressures of the court, but he refused to let Diana become another cautionary tale painted on the Althorpe walls. He decided he could no longer rely on telephone calls that were being intercepted by hostile ears. He had to confront her face to face, away from the sterile, bugged rooms of Kensington Palace. Through a series of back-channel communications involving his most trusted estate staff, Charles arranged for Diana to meet him at a secluded, private cottage on the outer boundary of the Althorpe estate. It was a place where they had played as children. A small stone building, hidden deep within a thick canopy of ancient oak trees. When Diana arrived, she looked ghost-like, her face pale and her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. She was wearing a simple trench coat, but her hands were still nervously picking at the gold watch. "They're pushing the Paris trip, Charles," she said the moment she stepped through the door, her voice trembling. "They say it's the only place where the paparazzi can be legally managed by private security. They say I'll be free there." "Who is telling you this, Diana?" Charles asked, closing the heavy wooden door behind her and locking it. "Is it the reporter, or the people funding your travel?" "Both," she whispered, looking around the small, dusty room as if she expected a camera to be hidden in the rafters. "They've coordinated everything. The hotel, the vehicles, the route. They say it's a secure corridor." "A secure corridor is just another word for an escort," Charles said, his voice flat and hard. "If they control the hotel, the cars, and the drivers, then they control your life, Diana. If you get into that car in Paris, you are entering an environment where you have zero control. I tried to warn you about the forged documents, I tried to warn you about the tracker. Please, you must stay here. Let me call the Home Secretary. Let me bring in Scotland Yard." Diana let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "Scotland Yard? Charles, who do you think authorized the surveillance in the first place?" The cold reality of Diana's words hung in the damp air of the stone cottage, paralyzing Charles with a profound sense of helplessness. It was a terrifying realization. The very institutions designed to protect the realm had been turned against his sister. He watched as she walked to the small wooden table in the center of the room. With trembling fingers, she reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a small, worn velvet jewelry box. It was a familiar item. The Spencer family crest was embossed on the top, though the gold leaf had flaked away long ago. She opened the box, revealing the tarnished silver signet ring that had belonged to their father. It was an ancient heirloom, a symbol of the Spencer bloodline's endurance through centuries of political upheaval and royal betrayal. "I want you to keep this, Charles," Diana said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I took it from Althorp years ago for good luck, but I feel like my luck has run out. If something happens to me, I need you to have it." "Nothing is going to happen to you, Diana," Charles said, his voice cracking as he stepped forward and closed his hands over hers. "I won't let it. We will fight this. We will expose the forged documents. We will expose the journalist, and we will show the world how they have hunted you." "You can't fight a machine that doesn't exist on paper," Diana replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. "They have already written the ending, Charles. They are just waiting for me to arrive at the set." She pressed the velvet box into his palm. As she did, her sleeve pulled back, exposing the heavy gold watch she had been gifted. In the dim, shadowed light of the cottage, Charles noticed a tiny raised seam along the back of the watch casing, a structural imperfection that was entirely out of place for a luxury timepiece. It was a subtle, haunting detail, a physical anomaly that Charles's mind catalogued but could not yet comprehend. "Promise me, Charles," Diana whispered, looking up at him with a desperate, maternal intensity. "Promise me that if the worst happens, you will protect William and Harry. Don't let them be raised by the people who did this to me." "I promise, Diana," Charles said, the weight of the oath settling like lead in his chest. "I swear it on our family name." As they stood in the quiet cabin, the wind began to howl through the ancient oaks outside, a sudden violent shift in the weather that felt like a warning from the earth itself. But the warning was already too late. The storm that had threatened Althorp finally broke, washing away the summer heat, but doing nothing to cool the burning panic in Charles's chest. It was late August, and Diana had gone to Paris. The news reports showed her entering the Ritz Hotel, surrounded by a chaotic wall of flashing cameras, but Charles's eyes were fixed on a different detail. His trusted contact inside the Ministry of Defense had sent a single, frantic message to Althorp's private fax machine. "The protocol has been initiated. The target is in the corridor." Charles tried desperately to reach her hotel suite, but every line was blocked. The Ritz switchboard repeatedly claimed there was a technical outage, but Charles knew better. The communication blackout was the final stage of the isolation protocol. In Paris, a strange sequence of events was already unfolding. The hotel's regular security team had been abruptly told to stand down. A secondary, unvetted security company took over the scheduling, and a driver who was not part of the standard Royal Rota was suddenly assigned to Diana's Mercedes. Inside the Ritz, Diana was being fed a highly specific, terrifying piece of intelligence by her handlers. A hostile group of photographers had supposedly leased a private apartment directly opposite her exit path to capture highly intrusive, compromising images of her through the windows. The only way to bypass this trap, they told her, was to take a decoy vehicle and follow a highly irregular, high-speed route through the Pont de l'Alma underpass. a concrete corridor known for its blind spots and complete lack of public surveillance cameras. Diana, exhausted and terrified, complied. As she walked toward the rear exit of the hotel, she checked her gold watch one last time, completely unaware that the tiny, raised seam on the casing was a high-frequency transponder. The device was not tracking her for her own safety. It was broadcasting a continuous, real-time telemetry signal directly to a specialized receiver mounted inside an unmarked vehicle waiting near the tunnel entrance. In London, Charles sat in his dark study, staring at the phone. He had a sudden, violent premonition of impact, a physical sensation of cold concrete and twisting metal that made him gasp for air. He picked up the silver signet ring Diana had given him, clutching it like a talisman. He knew, with an absolute and agonizing certainty, that his sister was being steered into a blind spot. The paparazzi were not chasing her to get a picture. They were being actively deployed as a physical wall, herd animals used to force her speeding vehicle into the exact lane where the trap had been laid. The cold, empty silence of Althorpe House was deafening. As Charles stood before his grandfather's desk, the ghost of his sister's memory finally laid bare. It had taken 29 years of agony, of quiet calculation, and of waiting for the right moment to strike. The official reports had long since been filed away, attributing the crash in the Pont de l'Alma underpass to a reckless driver and a chaotic media circus. But Charles knew the truth was far more calculated. The paparazzi had been nothing more than a loud, flashing decoy to mask a cold, military-grade execution. Slowly, Charles opened the faded, handwritten letter Diana had sent him via a trusted courier just days before her death. His eyes filled with tears as he read her elegant, frantic script aloud to the quiet room. "Dear Charles," he read, his voice cracking with a lifetime of held-back grief. "You were right. The watch they gave me had a tracking beacon. The brakes on the Mercedes feel loose, and the driver they assigned to me tonight isn't our usual staff. They told me we are taking a detour through the underpass to avoid the photographers, but the photographers are already waiting inside the tunnel. If something happens to me, don't let them tell the world it was an accident. Look at the ledger. Look at the ring." Charles placed the letter down and picked up the silver signet ring. With a steady hand, he turned the band over under the desk lamp. Under a jeweler's loupe, the truth was undeniable. Deep inside the inner band, a tiny, microscopic serial number had been laser-etched directly into the silver, a tracking designation matching the exact hardware used by the state's intelligence network to monitor high-value targets. It was the physical proof he had spent nearly 3 decades searching for. He had kept his silence for all these years, not out of fear for his own safety, but to fulfill the sacred oath he had made to Diana in that stone cottage. He had to protect William and Harry until they were grown, until they were strong enough to withstand the truth about the system that had consumed their mother. But now, the waiting was over. Charles turned his gaze to the window, watching the gray clouds finally part over the Althorpe estate, letting a single ray of sharp, unforgiving sunlight pierce the darkness of the study. The secret was out, and the ledger was finally open. "I tried to warn her," Charles whispered, his voice steadying into a hard, unyielding promise as he closed the mahogany drawer for the last time. "And now, the world finally knows why she couldn't run away."